All right, so in this video, I'm going to be explaining the basic anatomy of a game JSON. And we're going to look at the lexicon JSON, which is on staging. And the way to go to the JSON is to click JSON. So you're editing the JSON, and this is what it looks like, okay? It's this big, long document. Now, one thing I like to use a lot when I'm making games and debugging games and just trying to understand games, I use a tool called JSON Parser Online. If you just Google JSON Parser, it's the first result that comes up. I just copy paste the whole JSON into JSON Parser Online, and that lets me see it, as if it's a neatly formatted JSON, and I can very easily click into things and hide things and so on. A lot of times when you one thing to note is that when you try to save and exit a JSON, it will only save if the JSON is valid, if all the syntax is valid. So if you click save and exit and it doesn't actually exit, that means you have a syntax error somewhere in your JSON. And it can be pretty hard to figure out where just by wading through all this code. So I would typically, if I have an error and it's not saving, I copy paste the entire thing into JSON Parser Online. And JSON Parser Online, if there is an error, let's say I add an extra quotation mark over here, immediately it tells me there's an error, and then I can go and look for that error. And, it will appear somewhere in black. I don't know where I added this error, but yeah, right there, right? So it will show you where that error is, and then you can go and find it, right? Okay, so let's go through the basic skeleton of a game JSON. And it's worth saying all of this is documented pretty well. There's a number of documents that I will link you to, and you can read about every single possible field in every single possible block. But I think the top level structure is the important thing here. So the game JSON basically consists of these 6 pieces of the JSON. The first is called game init options. Game init options tells you how to set up the game. It's everything that happens right when you click the start button for the game. So usually this means roles. Roles and teams is the main thing that this handles. Roles, teams, presets for those teams, as well as a bunch of configuration options for how the game should work in the case of parallel games, in the case of turning spectators to players and vice versa. So we'll go through what's in that block, but it's essentially setup. Turn spectator to player actions is the block of code that gets called if a spectator decides to become a player. So it's a one-off block, and you can choose when to call that. Before loop actions is reserved for one-time setup actions for the game. So let's say that you are trying to change the layout of the call, and you're going to do that exactly once at the start of the game. You're changing it to a vertical layout. Or let's say that you want to initialize a bunch of variables. You want to initialize a bunch of variables to 0 and empty arrays, and you need these variables for the whole game. You want to change the background of the call. Anything that you want to do once at the start of the game, you should put it in before loop actions. Okay? Asking the host whether they want the tutorial, that always goes in there. So you'll see what a typical block looks like. Game loop is where the game happens. That is the most complex piece of the game JSON. It is an array, and that array represents a loop. So everything in the game loop will keep looping until it checks for the win condition somewhere and stops the game. Win condition is how you check for which team or player wins. So it's a bunch of Boolean conditions that evaluate to true or false. And if you ever call the win condition somewhere in the game JSON and it evaluates to true, then the game will end and it'll compute who the winners are. And finally, post-game actions are the actions that happen after the game is done. So let's quickly go through everything except the game loop, which we'll do in another video. So game init options. Again, all of this is really well documented. So a lot of these variables are self-explanatory, right? Minimum number of players, maximum number of players, preferred players quantity. These are all pretty straightforward. The main thing here is the roles and the teams. So you're specifying all the different teams that are in the call, in the game, and then you're specifying all the different roles and which teams they belong to, and any metadata about those roles and teams, images, descriptions, prefixes. All of this is pretty self-explanatory. And then finally, you have the roles preset, which tells you for each player count, how many of each role do you need. Again, you can inspect existing game JSONs to see how to do this. You might also have a game where you don't need presets because everyone has the same role. So there's a way to do that with default roles. You have your soundboard, which is the list of all the different sound files, and you alias them so that they have a name, and that way you can just call the name of that file with this alias. So there's your soundboard. There's your animations, which are these JSON files, and I'll show you how to make animations in the future. There's all the images that you need. These images are also aliased. You can use them in notifications. You can use them in voting widgets. So those are all your images. And that's pretty much everything you have. There's a few other optional things, but roles and teams, soundboard, animations, images, and role presets. That's what's in this block. Okay. Next, turn spectator to player actions. This is a list of actions. We'll go through how actions work in a separate video. Before loop actions, again, this is a list of actions. It gets called right before the game starts. So we'll go through that in a separate video as well, like how actions work. Game loop is all actions. Win condition is a set of, it's essentially a set of key value pairs, and the values are Boolean conditions that you want to evaluate. So for example, this is lexicon. You can have three possible teams that win. Either the commons win, or the con artist wins, or nobody wins. And you can see that the condition for the commons winning is that player is insider. This variable represents, did you vote at the con artist? It's called the insider in the JSON, but did you vote at the con artist correctly? And yes, guessed is, did you guess the word? So did you both guess the word correctly and correctly vote out the con artist, right? So that's what this Boolean action represents. Similarly, for the con artist, the word is guessed, but they were not voted out, and nobody wins if the word was not guessed, right? So that's a little sample of what the win condition might look like. And finally, the post-game actions is also a list of actions. So that is the basic anatomy of a game JSON, and in the next few videos we're going to discuss what are actions, what are action groups, and how do they all work, because most of these blocks, I realize now, are lists of actions. And yeah, let's do a deep dive into that.